If we are no longer under sin, but under grace, does that mean that, we can just continue our lives in sin and just receive grace upon grace every time that we sin? Does this create the ability to just have a reason for sin? Oftentimes, people disagree or have a problem with the message of grace because they feel like grace gives people the ability and the freedom to sin. They think that, because there is grace to be received, that people will just continue in living in sin and not be restricted. They will be free to just sin and sin and sin and receive grace, or that somehow this message encourages people to sin. To them, grace has become a license to sin. Or has it? My name is Pastor Gerald, and this is Grace Waves. Good morning, friend. Thank you so much for joining me on this beautiful morning for this episode of Grace Waves. Now in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 10, there is a verse that I often hear people misuse and abuse. And the verse goes like this. The Bible says, "But by the grace of God I am who I am. And His grace which was bestowed upon me was not in vain, but I labored more abundantly than they all. Not I, but the grace of God which was with me." Now, oftentimes you hear people use this verse as a license and a cloak for their lifestyles or the decisions that they make. Many people will say, well, I am what I am by the grace of God. Don't judge me. Like, I stand before God alone. And so these people use this verse as a reason and an excuse to hide behind. But we know that grace is not an excuse. In fact, if you just finish the verse, it says, "For I am who I am by the grace of God, and the grace that was bestowed upon me was not received in vain," which means that grace had its perfect work in Him. Grace is not an excuse to hide behind. It is not a pass for your sin. In fact, grace is quite the opposite. You see, Paul was saying here that it was only by God's grace that he was able to change. That it was not the product of his own efforts or his own abilities or his own gifts, but it was the gift of God's grace that actually enabled him to become a changed person. And so what Paul is saying, I am what I am, is not the old man, but he's talking about the new person. This is the new person that I have become, this apostle, this preacher of righteousness, this apostle unto the Gentiles. This is not because of me, this is because of God's grace. He saved me, He changed me, He transformed me. It was by the power of His grace. And so grace is the very thing that made him a new person, the very thing that enabled him to change. And there you see, he says that the grace which was bestowed upon me was not received in vain. We can receive grace in vain, and that is exactly what people do, because grace is there to equip you and to help you and to enable you to be transformed. It is the power of God to transform your life. It is the power of God to set you free from sin. Not to help you indulge in sin, but actually help you to say no to sin and overcome the power of sin. And you see this if you read in the book of Titus, chapter 2, in verse 11 and 12. Listen to this. The Bible says, "For the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared unto all men." Right? It's available for everyone. Teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. Grace teaches us, on the contrary, not to indulge in sin, but actually how to resist it, how to say no to it, how to reject ungodliness. And so grace is not that which enables me to sin, but that which enables me and teaches me not to sin. And it helps us so that we don't no longer remain under the power of sin, so that we don't heed our bodies as slaves of sin once again. And we can see this when you read in Romans chapter 6 in verse 1 and verse 2. Let me read that for you. The Bible says, "What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein?" Right? Shall we, should we just continue in sin now so that we can receive more grace? No, God forbid. He says, how can you that are dead to sin, you have died to sin, how can you breathe life back into sin again? Why would you do that? But by grace, you are able to live free from sin. You're able to be free from the grasp and the hold and the clutches of sin in your life. Then in Romans chapter 6, verse 15 and 16, just a little bit down, the Bible says, "What then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law and under grace?" Okay, so there's no law now. We're no longer under the law. Shall we sin now? And then he says, "God forbid." Again, "Know you not that whom you yield yourselves to obey, you are the servants of whom you obey, whether unto sin, unto death, or of obedience unto righteousness." So he's saying here, why would you submit yourself and enslave yourself again to that which God's grace has set you free from already? It's like being set free out of prison, and they open the door and say, "There you go, here's your stuff, you're free." And then you turn around and you walk back into the cell and you lock the door again. Why would you do that? Right? Why would you why would you submit yourself again to become a slave unto sin? And so grace is not grace is not a tool to enable us to sin. Grace does not, enable us to fall under the slavery of sin again. But in fact, grace enables us to be free. Grace enables us to become the servants of righteousness and not of sin. Grace is God's provision for you to be able to walk righteously. Grace is a gift from God, and therefore it should not be received in vain. We receive it in vain when we abuse God's grace, when we do not allow grace to have its outworking of its power in our lives, which is its transforming power in your life, to transform you, to help you to overcome the temptations and the sin and the failure and the weakness. But when we abuse grace and say, God will forgive me anyway, there is grace, I can just go ahead and sin, then we have abused grace. We have taken it in vain. And actually that grace is no longer able to help us at all. But we subject ourselves under the influence of sin once again. Grace is there when I fail, to help me get back up again. Grace is not there so that I can stay down, and roll around in the filth of my own wrong decisions, my weaknesses and my sin and my shame and my guilt. No, grace picks you up. It doesn't leave you down. And so to say that grace is a license to sin is absurd, because that would mean that grace takes your head and plunges it into the mud and say, hey, it's okay. You just go ahead and be filthy. You just go ahead and hurt yourself. Why would God enable you to destroy yourself? He loves you too much, and so His grace is the power to set you free. Think about the story in the Gospels of the woman that was caught in adultery. Right? It says that Jesus, didn't even look at her. Everybody wanted to stone her, and she was wrong. But then Jesus, when He spoke, and He said something, and then all the people went away, and then she was the only one there. And then He said to her, "Where is your accusers?" And she said, "There is none, Lord." And He says, "Neither do I condemn you. Neither do I condemn you." That is mercy. Mercy takes away the shame. Mercy takes away the guilt. Mercy takes away the punishment. And after that came grace. Jesus said, "Go and sin no more." That was grace. Grace empowers, grace gives, because those were more than just words of instruction. Those were words of empowerment. Those words empowered her to overcome the slavery and the grasp of sin. Grace, gracious words set her free. And so, friend, when you think about grace in your own life, never think of it as a pass for sin, but remember that grace is there to help you pass sin, to help you overcome sin, to help you have the victory and to conquer sin, which you already have in Jesus Christ. And so grace is the gift to enable you and to empower you and to make you strong when you are weak. As Jesus said in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 9, he said to Paul in the first part, he said, "My grace is sufficient for you because my strength is made perfect in weakness." And so when we receive grace, we actually receive God's strength for every situation, for every trouble, for every trial, for every temptation, for any circumstances. There is grace upon grace, not to enable you to fail, but to give you the victory, to empower you, to make you strong, to enable you to move forward by faith in God's righteousness. Thank you so much for listening today, friend. I hope that you enjoyed this message. And if you have, remember to click that like button to share this message. And please remember, if you have not yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, to do that so that you can be notified every time that we release a new devotional. May you have a wonderful day. And please remember, friend, listen to God's heartbeat. God bless you. Goodbye.